everybody, Craig Warrack here and welcome back to part 4 of my Secret Santa custom project for 2017 in which I'm making the One Punch Man villain, Crablante. In the previous episode you would have seen me research Crablante and pick out some fodder parts and mash them all together, cut them up, glue them, come up with a base body, and in this episode I'm going to get down to sculpting. As you can probably see here, I've already started on that because I'm not too sure how to achieve this guy's becoming a bit of a challenge, if I'm honest. It's already the middle of October and I feel like I'm a little bit behind schedule on this. My work has been really busy, so I'm a wee bit panicking that I'll get this finished in time. There's a lot of work to do, to be honest, but I will get it done. I will, and you'll watch me do it. So come on, let's take a closer look at this guy. Now, to be honest, I jumped around a lot in this custom trying to figure out how to get it all to work. So some of these clips will be out of sequence, but I've tried to arrange them for you as best I can. Before I went too far with sculpting, I wanted to finish off getting the head articulation in place. I decided to use a simple ball joint for the head and neck, so I took the neck peg from a Prometheus David figure and used that. I also enjoyed cutting off the face of one of the most frustratingly awful characters in all of sci-fi. Hurrah! I then sculpted a simple dome shape over that and took the neck peg from K2SO to use as Crablante's eye stalks. Adding some Figma wrist pegs to the end of these would mean I'd get a good range of motion out of the eyes. Crablante has a ton of sculpting, so I set out creating the general shapes of his body first. I didn't spend a lot of time on detail at first, as I want to make sure the general shapes work alongside his articulation. As ever, I'm using Milliput Epoxy Sculpt. It's easy for me to get hold of in the UK and it's what I'm familiar with using. I took a long time trying to get the sculpt on his main body to work around his torso articulation. However, in the end, I had to give up on the mid-torso rocker for a few reasons. Crablante's arms were always going to be really heavy with those massive claws, and that was just going to be pulling the torso rocker this way or that, depending on their balance. Also, Crablante's body is quite a smooth silhouette. The torso rocker breaks that silhouette up, and while I did toy with making it look more armoured, lobster-like even, I decided to just sacrifice the torso rocker and focus his body articulation on being just that ab crunch. I then took some time to think about how I was going to achieve the crustacean, crusty texture all over his body. There was no way I was going to sculpt all of the little knobbly bobbly bits, so at first I tried stippling the surface with a toothbrush. It gave it a decent pitted texture, so that was one option, but then I tried turning my heat gun on the sculpt and it made the surface of the sculpt bubble and warp, creating a really nice haphazard texture. This was the technique I ended up using. It was easy and quick to do. Something I noticed was that if the bubbles were too big, they became fragile and would crumble when touched, but as long as I caught these before moving on to painting, they would just add to that crustacean texture. The shoulder armour posed a bit of a puzzle for me. They need to be able to rotate forward and back with the arms, but also not get in the way when the arms lift up. So first of all, I worked on getting the shape of the armour. I glued together a few strips of styrene to create a frame and the general shape I wanted the armour to take around the shoulder. Then I sculpted on top of it with Milliput and then adding the detail and texture to it. I then used the ankle joint from this Titanfall figure just because I had it to hand and installed it into the shoulder to create this pivot. That allows the shoulder armour to articulate outwards so that it can move out the way when he has to raise his arm. The claws are an important part, of course, but part of the challenge here is that the pincers are long and thin, and that's something that epoxy putty doesn't usually deal well with. If you sculpt long, thin things, then they tend to snap. So I use some of this very sturdy, multi-morph plastic. You've probably seen this, but it comes as these little beads, and when you put them in hot water, they become a pliable plastic that you can then shape. When the plastic cools, it becomes very sturdy, so I used this to form a frame for the pincers and would then sculpt on top of that. I used the knee joint from that fodder Titanfall figure for the pincer articulation as it was ratcheted. With a big heavy figure like this, I found it important to use these steady ratcheted joints. And then it was just a case of sculpting the rest of the figure and hitting it with the heat gun to get the texture. The lower half, the underwear and legs, were pretty straightforward to sculpt after all of the work on the upper half. So that's Crablante pretty much all sculpted. There's some final minor tweaks I need to do here and there, but that's him. I added in some leg hair there on the shins. He has that in the drawing, so I wanted to add that in. That's just the bristles of a toothbrush, and I've pushed that into
some milliput on his legs. It's not dry yet, so I'm not sure if that's going to stay in there. But that's about him done. It's really been, as you can hopefully see, super extensive sculpting. Every part of him is pretty much covered in sculpt now, apart from, you know, the articulation points around his legs there. So it took a long time. Next step is to paint him. I'm hoping that he has a pretty simple paint job, but who knows? So hopefully you'll join me in the next episode when I get to painting this guy and actually finishing him up. So until then, pour on the power. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.